Our paper today is entitled Mission Impossible: What Will It Take to Change Mentalities Towards Reduction of Gender-Based Violence and Femicide in Higher Education Institutions. This paper was compiled by Professor Tseko and Ms. Nozipho Simelane. If we look at the introduction, the scourge of gender-based violence and femicide has surged as a new pandemic after the COVID-19 pandemic, which took over the baton from its predecessor and continues to ravage and eradicate societal and moral fiber. It is argued that the post-school education and training TESED sector as a microcosm of communities has been significantly affected by this so-called pandemic. It is against this backdrop that the Department of Higher Education and Training, through Higher Health, launched Transforming MENtalities Summit 2023 to end off Women's Month during August. Higher Health is one of the entities that is established to assist the Department of Higher Education to deal with the scourge of violence as well as gender-based violence in higher educations across South Africa. Then, during this summit, the theme for the 2023 explored, amongst others, the emergence and frequent instances of reproduction of societal pathologies on campuses, such as rape and violent murders typically committed against women and girls. Given the socio-cultural, economic, legal, and political inequalities that drive gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa, successive post-1994 governments have put several legislative and policy frameworks in place to address the matter. The rights of everyone who lives in South Africa are enshrined in the Constitution 1996, particularly in Chapter 2, the Bill of Rights. Then these rights affirm the democratic values of human dignity, equality, and freedom from gender-based violence and femicide. The problem statement that we have identified for this particular study, is that although there appears to be a political will at the national level to address the demons of gender-based violence and femicide in higher education institutions, challenges related to insufficient funding, budgetary limitations, and a lack of collaboration and effective coordination among government departments have hindered progress in implementing both the DHET policy framework to address gender-based violence and femicide in the PSET system, as well as what we have observed over the years in South Africa. I need to indicate that the President of South Africa has held several summits to deal with gender-based violence in South Africa. And we have seen that progression within the higher education institutions. But it seems like, there's a lack of coordination as well as relevant stakeholders working together to be able to address this scourge of gender-based violence and femicide. Training among higher education institutions, communities, police and government department on the legislative changes has been inadequate. Too few gender-based violence desks have been established at police stations. Normally, we refer to it as community service centers, and too few rape kits have been provided. Meanwhile, shelters which are supposed to care for survivors of gender-based violence lack funding support. The Commission for Gender Equality face resistance and a lack of cooperation from government department as it sought to assess the effectiveness of official efforts to encounter gender-based violence and femicide. There was also a lack of clarity about who was responsible for driving the National Strategic Plan, and the implementation was found to be patchy or non-existent to some of the places, including within the higher education institutions, where it is also very challenging to be able to assess statistics to be able to determine the extent of the problem. Now, the purpose of our study was to examine the prevalence and factors underlying gender-based violence and femicide in higher education institutions, of which findings may be used by both the government, policymakers, stakeholders, including higher education institutions across South Africa. So now, when we look at, is it possible to extend that then it's possible to engage men and boys in South Africa, considering the murder rate as well as, annually and quarterly in South Africa, when the Minister of Police is issuing the crime reports in terms of, how the South African Police Service have performed, on that particular regarding violent contact crimes, then quarter and, after quarter, we observed that, gender-based violence is something that is so evasive to be dealt with. During COVID, it was argued that because of the close confinement of the abusers as well as the victims, then the crime or the incidence of gender-based violence and femicide, skyrocketed. And then we also observed that after COVID-19, then the police then will still need to be able to pull up their socks in terms of dealing with this. But, we understand that it's not only the function of the South African Police Service to be able to deal with the issues of scourge of gender-based violence across, the communities as well as within institutions of higher learning. It is the responsibility of other, civics or associations or organizations, as well as other stakeholders, to be able to engage men as well as boys, to realize that the bodies of those that are, of female gender, do not belong to them. Therefore, engaging men is an increasingly common element in violence prevention work and building gender equality. Now, however, other researchers, as well as, research that has been done, observe that there are some concerns that involving men might have negative consequences for the feminist work. Even though, there's a lot of work that is now unfolding, there's still a platform that has to be created, to be able to inform both men and boys regarding issues relating to gender-based, violence and femicide. There has been, backlash regarding take a girl child to work, where other researchers have been indicating that isn't it now a reversal discrimination, towards men, and whereby they will feel like, as well as boys, whether they are now being, sidelined. It is therefore essential that a holistic approach is needed, whereby, men and boys, as well as those that are now enrolled in higher education, to be able to, to see themselves as part of the solution, rather than, there has been some movements where, because of the backlash of men and some of the men perpetrators killing women, where there has been, a movement such as #MENaTrash. It is instances such as that normally, bring more division as well as a rift between men as well as those who really want to bring the solution into the into the table or to the table. Now, when we look at the research framework or methodology, we provided with a content qualitative technique that we thought that is appropriate, where we had to, go through around over 84 papers, that to be able to analyze what has been researched, what is still remain as a gap, to understand the challenges as well as the factors of engaging men, what are those contributing factors, so that, this can also inform practice as well as a policy. Now, consequently, scoping reviews are more suited, to addressing this kind of particular research. Now, therefore, this review adopted the framework described by Axie and O'Malley and elaborated upon by Levesque, Coloquian, and O'Brien, which sets out a 5-stage approach, identifying the research question, identifying the relevant studies selection, charting the data, as well as collating, summarizing, and reporting. Now, what we have observed when we, synthesize literature over that quite a number of papers, we have come across, 5 themes that emerge that also need to be further research towards informing policy and practice. The first one theme is the role of policymakers in higher education institutions. Number 2, learning communities obligation. What is it that learning communities are obliged to do? Number 3, the call for help and access. Number 4, the student initiatives is also one of the things that emerge, that, it is also their responsibility that they have to take initiatives to ensure that the spaces where they are learning and is also safe. And lastly, the impact or the consequences of gender-based violence underpinning intentional research. And then this are briefly discussed in this presentation, but they are broadly discussed in the paper that we have submitted that is due for review. The theme number 1, the role of policymakers. We have observed that the role of academic staff is important, not only for policymakers, but also we have institutions within higher education, such as Senate, such as student bodies, as well as, those that are working within security entities, that needs to be able to assist the policymakers to be able to come with policies that will be able to regulate the behaviors of all communities within learning institutions domain. Hence, developed programs to prevent gender-based violence and femicide attacks on higher educations can be implemented better through the help of, administrators. It is their function. It is also their obligations to be able to mobilize both the staff as well as the students to be able to, to work together to form, a policy that will be able to be monitored regularly. And it is also encouraging to see that the Department of Higher Education through Higher Health has also come with, legislative frameworks that are needed by the Department of, by higher education institutions to be able to provide with quarterly reports in terms of, what is it that there has been implemented within campuses. Now, on theme 2, learning communities obligations, as I did indicate within theme 1, it is also their role, because for them to be able to create a conducive learning environment, they also need to be able to, participate actively. We have observed in South Africa the theme called Sex for Marks, where lecturing staff, they will intentionally, fail students, whereby students will have to depend upon, the lecturers to be able to, to allow them to progress to the next grade through offering their bodies. And then it is therefore very much essential that both the students as well as the other teaching staff that do not subscribe to this kind of immoral acts to be able to join hands so that, acts such as abuse within learning institutions should be able to be reported, as well as, as I indicated with the theme 1, that also the policies should not only be drafted, but also should be seen to be effective towards addressing any kind of immorality or kinds of abuse that is taking place within classroom settings, as well as within learning spaces. Then theme 3, there is a call for help and access. We have observed that, as much as, those that are within campus environments, the universities or institutions of higher learning should be able to provide with access, but also with a platform where, now and then there should be, a circulation, within intranet, as well as with via emails, and as well as the websites of these institutions, to say that, you are allowed to come forth to be able to mention, any atrocities that are taking place within the learning spaces, but also access to such facilities where, the complainants or the victims should be able to afford, access to be able to report, as well as to be afforded the opportunity, to be provided with a feedback regarding the progress that has been made in terms of the investigation. Then we also come across theme 4, which talks about the initiatives from students, because they are also stakeholders within higher learning institutions. It is also their rights to be able to mobilize student structures within universities, as well as, able to address any kind of issues that they foresee that it is taking place, such as that is harming their, their bodies, as well as the providing with insecurities within learning institutions. Therefore, theme 4 identified that students also have obligations to come forward. It has been observed that, in South Africa, there are, not all institutions, but there are some, popping up stories via media, whereby, students are being intimidated to come forth to be able to report. Therefore, it calls upon the management, the administrators, as well as student structures to be able to work, and collaborate, as well as the South African Police Service to create and to allow, structures such as, community policing within institutions of higher learning, whereby, students will be able to mobilize as well as report, and then also provide with recommendations in terms of what is it that they wish to see in line with the policies that institutions of higher learning, have developed. Then theme 5, which is the last theme, then it's about the consequences and the trauma that, the victims, as well as those that are survivors of gender-based violence are subjected to, whereby, there is a culture of silence, whereby, those victims, they go through trauma, whereby they are afraid to be able to report. And therefore, it is not enough that there should be policies within institutions of higher learning, but also mechanism whereby victims are able to provide it with the adequate services that they require. Therefore, a growing body of evidence documents the consequences of gender-based violence and femicide attacks for victims' health and well-being, ranging from fatal outcomes such as, where people or victims are being killed, where victims also take their own lives, as well as, sexual related sicknesses and diseases, because sometimes they are subjected to rape as well as sexual assault without protective, tools so that they can be able to, and therefore, based on research, there's really, physical injuries, chronic pain syndrome, and other disorders that has been observed because the victims, the survivors, suffers in silence, and some who made it, to counseling, they relate the stories of how, they are tortured and they are suffering in silence. It is clearly crucial for higher education institutions to ensure that they create a safe learning environment where students receive help, and adequately. So as I conclude, it is therefore very much necessary for all role players, stakeholders, to take power inequalities within, research process. Also, the literature that has been provided should really synchronize well so that it can be able to provide, information as well as inform policy and practice within higher education institutions to be able to assist the Department of Higher Education as well as colleges, PSET sector in South Africa. Despite efforts by the DHET through Higher Health to promote reciprocity and empowerment of women and men on campus, there continues to be a risk that lack of active participation of relevant stakeholders, including men, as seen by the slow pace at which gender-based violence policies are developed and implemented in higher education institutions. The context of gender-based violence and femicide attacks on campuses, if not understood, can lead to an unsafe learning and teaching environment where, attrition rate will increase. This study provides some insight into the prevalence of gender-based violence and femicide incidents at higher education in South Africa, as well as, whether is it possible to mobilize men as well as boys, mainly, those that are within learning communities. More systematic research across all universities and colleges in the country is needed to accurately guide policy development and prevention efforts. It is therefore important for all higher education institutions in South Africa to recognize their responsibility in addressing, gender-based violence and femicide, and find a way of supporting the victims in a reasonable and fair manner. Thank you very much. We look forward for the comments so that we can be able to work on those issues that are addressed by the reviewers. Thank you very much.